Thanks. I'm going to pick up where Alta left off, in a sense. Basically, I've been asked to talk about international issues arising when we're trying to bring stem cell research into the treatment of human beings. What happens? What issues arise? And to do so in light of what's happening abroad. Here we go. I'm going to go very quickly through some of these. This is just a depiction of where stem cell research is being conducted in various parts of the world, brown, orange, and green. I'm not even going to explain that. This is the sort of situation that Clive was talking about. You have somebody who's in a persistent vegetative state. Her family can't afford to take her abroad. She was taken to China. The family insists that she's improving, and apparently they feel that they can detect some minor changes in her development. They want to go back again and again. We're assuming that she received cord blood stem cells. That's what they were told. Here's stem cell treatment in Mexico. This is for a little boy who was born blind, paralyzed with cerebral palsy. Again, the family says he's improving. They can detect some very minor changes. Again, they could afford to go to have this treatment done. There is some degree of oversight of stem cell research in some countries internationally, but by and large, these patients are going to countries where there is very little oversight. And we can't shrug this off and say, well, in our country, you know, at least we've got some degree of oversight, even if it's kind of patchworky, because it's people from our country who are going there who are desperate. They're the ones who are using this as their last resort, as you know, John pointed to and Alta also suggested. They're responding to ads that they see, and in some cases, they may not be desperately ill, but want to have something fixed up, and it's suggested they might combine it with a pleasant vacation in India. So that you have unregulated treatments, unregulated stem cell banks springing up all over the world, basically. And there is simply no way of knowing whether this stuff is any good or whether it's going to kill you. It could pose disease, serious injury, and even death risks to the people going abroad. We've heard about these treatments in Russia, the Ukraine, Pakistan, Thailand. I could go through a whole list of countries. What I want to do is have a quick look at Russia and at India to see what's going on in these countries. Now, in Russia, you'll find that there are clinics, medical clinics, and beauty salons that are advertising stem cell treatments. They say they can repair damaged tissue, and they can also rejuvenate aging bodies. And these clinics claim to offer adult, fetal, and embryonic stem cell therapies for conditions ranging from Parkinson's disease to facial skin wrinkling. I guess this is sort of what Clyde was talking about when he was expressing concerns about some of this in relationship to Parkinson's disease in particular. Here's a clinic that offers injections of what it claims are stem cells. We don't really know what kind, into patients. At this clinic, what they're doing is they're shooting into this woman's behind stem cells derived from a piece of fat that had been surgically removed from another patient's stomach. She paid more than $10,000 for this treatment, and the results have been minimal. Basically, these clinics are businesses, and their primary goal is to make money. Yet it's illegal in Russia to provide stem cell therapies unless your clinic has been licensed for this purpose. In 2005, the head of Russia's Healthcare and Social Development Control Agency, which is a mouthful, became alarmed by the rapid growth in stem cell therapies and closed down 37 clinics that were by and large cosmetic stem cell clinics. But that was only just a small number of the many clinics that there are just in Moscow. The enforcement of the law has been lax. One guy who runs a clinic that is the Institute for Stem Cell Studies, and also known as Beauty Plaza, says, look, we're pretty shrewd. We know what the law is, and we know how to manipulate the law, and what the law does not forbid is allowed, and we are taking advantage of that. The Institute of Biological Science, also known as IBM, applied for a license for a stem cell treatment. There were a lot of questions about whether this license should have been granted, but it was granted, reports suggest, because a Russian tycoon and several state officials who had gotten cosmetic treatment there themselves said, this is great stuff. They gave it special support, and it got the license. An American doctor sums it up this way. In Moscow, everybody is his or her own guinea pig. In India, it's not quite the same. It's a little different. You have scientists in India who are very well regarded. Some of the initial stem cell lines, the presidential lines that Alta was talking about, I think at least one set was derived by a scientist from India. But there are inadequately tested stem cell treatments being promoted as cures there. And there's almost a do-it-yourself kind of attitude among researchers, and clinicians really, who are considered pretty good. This quote suggests that, they're kind of reading stuff, trying it out on patients, and seeing whether it works. But this is not acceptable for clinical research. You need, well, we'll go into that in a minute, what you do need. The highly regarded Prasad Eye Institute in Hyderabad in India announced in 2005 that it had transplanted stem cells into the eyes of more than 240 patients with damaged corneas. And in that same year, the Times of India announced that a respected heart surgeon at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences had injected bone marrow stem cells into 35 patients with end-stage cardiac disease during coronary bypass surgery. The majority of those treated had improved, they said, and the Times said this was a global first. Well, when this got into the news and there was a reaction to this from abroad, it gave people in India a pause because none of these therapeutic projects had undergone review by the regulatory bodies that were authorized to confirm scientific claims like this, safety and efficacy of their treatments, and the provenance of their stem cells. The head of the Indian Council of Medical Research told a reporter from the journal Nature, we're only a block away from this institute, and we had no idea this was happening there. And she put the institute's research on hold. Now, in 2005, there were two sets of guidelines in India. They had rival bodies, and in 2001, the Department of Biotechnology issued one set of guidelines, and in 2002, in response, the Indian Council on Medical Research issued a set of guidelines, and they established basically a mess. So what happened when all of this bad publicity came out was the two groups said, we need to have one coherent set of guidelines, and they began to negotiate them and completed them in 2007. And these guidelines established two basic kinds of committee, one called the National Apex Committee, and the others are local institutional committees for stem cell research. Now, what's interesting about them is clinical trials have to have the prior approval of the local stem cell research committee and the drug controller of India, but they only need to be registered with the National Apex Committee. So it certainly seems as though the local committee is in charge. And it sounds as though they've got the potential to mimic the rivalry that the older two oversight bodies got into, because you're going to have the apex committee and the local committee fighting with each other. But it doesn't really matter, because as of the end of February of this year, these guidelines had not been made into law. They have absolutely no teeth, and nobody is going to observe them the way they were not observing the old guidelines. So the problems are these techniques are not well described. The cells are poorly characterized, if at all. The patient's conditions before and after the use of cells are not documented thoroughly. And basically, they seem to be recording what happens to patients, if they're even doing that. So you've got potentially dangerous experiments, and you're not really able to show what their effects are. It's just hit and miss. What should they be doing? You need to set up predefined clinical questions, follow standardized procedures and evaluations, carry out rigorous follow-up, clear documentation, and you need to obtain safety data from animals. Otherwise, you're using human subjects as guinea pigs. Well, as Alta pointed out toward the end of her talk, stem cell research is developing in a way that requires some kind of cooperation among states here, and in countries abroad, it's becoming an international effort. Various countries are trying to figure out how they can develop ways of cooperating with each other so that they can trade results from one country to another. And these are just some of the bodies that have been trying to regulate stem cell research in their countries. I've served for 3 years on the Canadian Institute of Health Research on their Stem Cell Oversight Committee. The FDA is up there, although it has, as Alta pointed out, somewhat more limited control. But there are countries that also have greater control. What sort of policies should we try to write, or should be written into national and international directives to protect the health, safety, and rights of the people who are seeking treatments? And what about those donating the materials for such treatments? Well, one stab at doing this has been made by the European Union. This is a group of countries whose members are shown on this map. It's developed a regulatory framework for research in stem cell therapy that applies to all of its member countries, those that accept the use of human embryonic stem cells and those that don't, so that they can write in what is appropriate to the way their country works. And it issued a Tissues and Cells Directive that was developed in 2004 and began to be adopted by its member countries in 2006. Its aim is to set standards for obtaining, testing, processing, storing, distributing, and importing and exporting 3 different kinds of stem cells across the European community. So in a sense, what it's trying to do is what we would hope we could do in the United States across various states. An initial and major concern is patient safety that they are trying to address. They're also concerned about informed consent. And they set out the kind of information that should be given to donors. It requires that, for instance, this is not the whole thing, because I couldn't possibly give you the whole thing in our short time, but for instance, such donors have to be traceable. Their identity has to be coded, so they're kept anonymous, but if they do need to go back and check on them, they should be able to do so for 30 years. Alta mentioned, the fact that there are some stem cells that were developed from embryos that involved gamete donors. That is very hairy, so that they're trying to figure out ways of being able to trace back those kinds of embryos too, so they know just what genetic material went into them, whether these people have developed any genetic diseases subsequent to their donation. And then they want the final products and the patients who receive them to be traceable as well. Now, the specific consent standards are left to each country because some countries don't allow the use of embryonic stem cells. And they want to ensure that no payments are made for donated cells and tissue. Okay, so we've got this basic framework set up. The United Kingdom was the first major country, or the only country so far, France is also doing it, that has adopted the EU directives into UK law. It enacted the human tissue regulations in 2007, and it established a new body, the Human Tissue Authority. And I'm not going to go into details about this, much as I didn't go into details about the European Union directive. But basically, it is the body that licenses and regulates all centers that are using human tissue, including stem cells. They had a tremendous scandal about the use of donated organs and the use of tissues that were donated. And so they've lumped all of their tissue regulation into this Human Tissue Authority directive. For instance, one of the things that they make very clear is that it's an offense for institutions to procure, store, process, blah, 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 for human application without a license. So people in Russia who were under a similar regime would have to have a license. They couldn't play around with stem cells and put humans at risk. The failure for, I don't know if I had that up there or not, the failure for getting informed consent from patients is 3 years in jail. So I'm going to hurry through this because we're running short of time, but you can see that, you know, they do have pretty specific requirements. These are written into regulations. The law sets up the Human Tissue Authority, but it doesn't write these into law. The reason that they're written into regulation is they want to be responsive to changing situations. And you can change regulations to meet current needs. It's much harder to change the law. They've set up a stem cell bank, and basically they require all stem cell lines that scientists create to be placed into this bank, and they must be in the public domain. So they can't patent their stem cell lines. It's an independent authority that tests stem cells, releases stocks of existing stem cell lines for research and therapy. So it guarantees the purity and provenance of these stem cell lines, and it provides certain assurances to patients that they're going to get stem cells that are of decent quality and that have been derived according to ethical standards of research and clinical applications. It also is responsible for monitoring the use of these stem cell lines. More about national standards. What should we start thinking about in terms of national standards here and abroad, anywhere, when there's a new presidential regime here in this country, and if there is a chance of developing some national standards, what should we be looking for? Well, you need some sort of legislative framework for tissue and cell donation and transplantation. Again, you want the specific regulations left to some agency. We need an agency for that purpose. You want appropriate standards regarding safety and efficacy. You want to identify basic informed consent requirements for donors, and you also want them for recipients. And again, you need to protect their voluntariness, their privacy, make sure they're informed about what these are used for. You want to follow through on implementation so that you want to inspect and authorize screening, testing, all of that good stuff, both on imports and exports. And you want to confirm that there are quality systems established. And then you need an authority to control compliance with standards. So that it's not enough to set up the regs. You want to make sure that they're being followed after you set them up. Alta was suggesting that there is a big financial interest in having some sort, well, she didn't say this explicitly, but implicitly she was saying, in having some sort of regulation, surprisingly, by private businesses, because they want to be able to have their stem cell treatments, stem cell lines used across various jurisdictions. And we have here a quote from a fellow who's chair of the Advanced Cell Therapies Working Group in Europe. And he basically says a proper legal framework for the market authorization of these products is likely to stimulate increased research in this field. So this sort of gives you an overview of what's happening internationally, an overview of what's not being done, what the risks are, what we really should be somewhat scared about, and what we might start thinking about in terms of how to address this in the future, and recognize that even if we finally set up a framework in the United States that covers both private research and treatment that are going on and publicly funded research, we're also going to have to set up a regime that has something in common with those that are set up abroad so that we can import and export treatments and materials having to do with stem cells. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.